Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review Season 4, Episode 6 of The Masked Singer. So, ultimately, we're going to go through and I'm going to tell you who had gone home via mascotted name. Then, ultimately, at the very end of this episode, you're ultimately going to actually see who ultimately had legitimately been under that mask. So, otherwise, you will not get any spoilers to the very end of this episode, so feel free to just watch these and maybe guess along with me in the comments section. So, going into this, like the mushroom, I think overall, like he's probably going to end up clearly, easily in the top 3 or 4. When kind of hearing his first performance and how basically everybody was easily blown away. Now in this episode, like I think the song choice was a little bit better. I really want to see something out of Mushroom to where we were just overwhelmingly like, whew, oh man, like I'm waiting for that time to happen, and I don't think it quite has happened yet. So, because I'm really wanting like songs that like make you feel something. Like I remember when Rottweiler, the season where Rottweiler was doing his thing, man, like a lot of the songs that he did were great choices or just ultimately at some point made you feel something. Like I've yet to see that in season 4. It feels like a lot of the songs in season 4 have kind of been honestly phoned in or just kind of just there isn't enough there for me to really like invest in these performances just yet. Like there's nothing that is gonna like go, whoa, I felt something there. So going into this, the mushroom I still assume could quite possibly be Sam Smith, the guy who ultimately did Writing on the Walls, with the Spectra soundtrack from 007. Frank Ocean ultimately could be a choice that everyone voices their opinion upon to ultimately think that this person is. This week's guest is ultimately Adam Lambert, who hopefully we now would very much know him as the newest lead singer for Queen, but ultimately before that he had been on American Idol. So, knowing full well, I've seen Adam Lambert on concert performances with Queen. I've seen him do any number of things. Listen to some music of his at some points, mostly the song "Runnin'." Yeah, it could quite possibly be the Mushroom. Could be easily Adam Lambert because of the numerous times that he's kind of done late night talk shows, kind of participated in those. So could be Adam Lambert. Moving on. The broccoli. So ultimately, I have different choices this time around. Besides, still assuming that it could be Jim Belushi. Ultimately, I kind of liked the song choice with broccoli. It was kind of a real fun song that ultimately kind of gave people like the emotional like this feels good like that kind of moment. So ultimately, otherwise it being Jim Belushi, I could immediately say that ultimately uh, McCarthy ended up mentioning that the clue package ultimately went into a name called Frank. And immediately within my mind or my kind of grind away of thinking of who this could quite possibly be, I ultimately went to Frank Caliendo, who ultimately had very much been with football from time to time, doing the John Madden impression that he's mostly famous for. A lot of times he would do football calls and stuff like that. A lot of times he would dress up as Charles Barkley or any number of people and do impressions on them. Um, any number of things that ultimately I would assume that Frank Caliendo had done at some point in time, like for the football for NFL. Like I naturally assumed that it could be Frank Caliendo because a lot of times you just end up having it be someone tied to the NFL or football like broadcast. We had Bradshaw 1 year, so ultimately, why not have Frank Caliendo here as well? Ultimately, from the sound of this character, it sounded like Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Like, I was like, man, this guy very much bizarrely sounds like Larry David, and I don't know why. But justifiably, it could be any number of these three men. At the end of the day, who's to say? Because ultimately, Broccoli didn't go home. Ultimately, letting everybody know now, the squiggly monster had gotten home. So ultimately, Squiggly Monster ultimately will be guest upon within this episode. So let's move on. Speaking of which, Squiggly Monster. So we have a very random barrage of guessing. Ultimately, Ted Danson had been chosen as the Squiggly Monster through some of the judges. David Hasselhoff had been chosen within the judges. Ultimately, I've jokingly mentioned Barack Obama just because of how many numerous political things had been added into this clue package. Ultimately, it seems like I had a very much ditch effort because repetitiously everyone was saying that it was Bob Saget. So I'm like, you know what? Maybe it is actually Bob Saget. I wouldn't have come to that conclusion right away. But ultimately, I'm like, you know what? It probably could be. There are some clues that do convince me that it could quite possibly be uh, Full House actor Bob Saget. Well, he's done a lot more than that. He's been in Half Baked and a lot of other things. And so at the end of the day, yeah, could have been Bob Saget. Could have been, as I pronounce that incorrectly, Bob Saget. Um, I don't know. We'll have to go into figuring out, without a doubt, by the end of this episode, if I was right and or wrong. And so let's move on to the very last person. So ultimately, we have the jellyfish. Ultimately, I had mentioned probably maybe it's Dakota Fanning, just because of the clue the week before. I honestly don't understand most of this clue package because the clue package talks about this person going into their parents' previous gigs. So ultimately, that could lend into it being some person who is kind of siphoning off some other person's fame, which ultimately could be any number of guesses. Ultimately, a lot of people might have their different variations. Plenty of people have random esh like questions to think about who any of these things are, but by and large, I also kind of threw down Billy English just because it's Tuesday. I think honestly, when I finally listened to a Billy English song, not for very long though, but ultimately when I heard it, I'm like, you know what? This could sound like the jellyfish. I could be completely wrong because everybody sounds like everybody at some point, especially once you've uh, kind of just kind of go through the grinder of hoping that somebody is someone that you think that it might be ultimately. So yeah, these are my guesses. Ultimately, a lot of people might have a lot of better ones when looking at it. A lot of people could not justify maybe Dakota Fanning. I don't think I can even justify it anymore. I just randomly threw this out there and ultimately justified it on the other episode. So going into this now, because ultimately you would think that this is a person that has never sung before and is now being very successful at singing. So yeah, could be any number of random esh like people that honestly it doesn't make sense. It could be David Cassidy's daughter that ultimately was from the show Arrow. Could be her. I don't know. Disciple going into the music industry or whatever it is. I don't remember what her name is from Arrow, but look up the word Cassidy and Arrow and Cassidy, and you'll probably figure out what that name is. But anyways, those are all my guesses for this week. Ultimately, we have another week to ultimately justify if I was right and or wrong, and hoping that our next leap is the leap to another episode where I can get things correct. So at the end of the day, let's finally go into the spoiler variation of this show, and then we'll get into a seasonal recap. Ultimately, there, in fact, mentioning who we thought these people were at the end of this. So let's bust out that sweet, delicious double five, and let's otherwise go into the spoiler territory of this show, where we let you know if I was finally right and or wrong, hoping the next leap is the leap home. So now, we are going to tell you who is the squiggly monster right now. Bob Saget, actor, host, comedian, of course, funniest home videos, Full House, Fuller House, Half Baked, a lot of other different barrage of things, ultimately being tied to otherwise. Speaking of me talking about Quantum Leap, I even know he was in a Quantum Leap episode. Because ultimately, yeah, I talk about Quantum Leap a lot on this show, or a lot on any channel whatsoever. More than likely, I should just dust out Quantum Leap and review it, because ultimately, how many numerous times I spill that quote out there into the ether of things. But yeah, knowing full well Bob Saget is a great guy. Like, ultimately, yeah, a lot of people have said, like, he's a father figure to a lot of people. Like, he's just a kind, nice-hearted soul. I remember watching his Joe Rogan interview, the whole thing, and him just talking about how he just loved Richard Pryor, and how basically uh, he just really he just really loved that man. And so reasonably, I was like, man, this like Bob Saget is so interesting and so fascinating, and ultimately hearing full well that at some points in time he and John Stamos, who ultimately, of course, plays Uncle Jesse on Fuller House or Full House, ultimately he does like jam sessions with him, which is kind of interesting and fun to hear. So ultimately knowing full well, like, yeah, Bob probably does do a lot of singing and stuff like that, probably when a jam session otherwise provides that time to do so. So yeah, not not a pretty decent voice. Like, when looking at this and hearing him for the first time, I actually thought that he was like a professional singer. Like, to the point to where my first time around guessing honestly was like Lenny Kravitz, just because ultimately I was like, man, this guy sounds really, really great. And so ultimately, yeah, seeing him do this performance and watching him on here again is just like, man, this is so fun. This is so great, and hopefully, he had a great time doing it. I hope. So at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to a season so far recap. Let's go, in fact, move on. So I just shoved right into the seasonal recap. So ultimately, so far, we still Buster Rhymes, of course, was correct for me. Brian Austin Green, not so much, because ultimately, Brian Austin Green is a wonderful, talented man, but I could not candidly come up with that guess. Of course, we had Mark Sanchez as the alien baby, which ultimately, how could you guess that? So both of those last two were incorrect. Ricky, or Mickey, Ricky, Mickey Rourke, blah, 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 blah. Mickey Rourke, ultimately Gremlin Unmasked, correct. That is thankfully good gravy, god, squiggly monster. Bob Saget, ultimately correct. And then Lips, of course, uh, was Wendy Williams. So ultimately, I've gotten at least four correct now, luckily for me. Ultimately, some decisions were made seemingly at the last second. The whole Bob Saget thing was like seconds in the making for me. It was just like ultimately like, you know what, everyone is going with Bob Saget, so you know what? I'll just go with Bob Saget. Like, I ultimately like, he sounds great, and ultimately I was thinking of an actual singer because Bob sounds so great. He does. So ultimately, yeah. Luckily for me, I chose Bob Saget, and it was on there. Luckily, no. Luckily enough, it was last second choices, and so luckily I chose right. Luckily I chose correct. With no regret, because ultimately I guess too many people. So ultimately now we by far and large have reasonably a bulk of people correct, but ultimately I still I'm much more concerned about the next times, the next episodes, the next times around. Because ultimately, I don't want to rest on just going, well, I have a majority of things correct. Because ultimately, I probably should have known some kind of clue from somewhere that maybe meant absolutely nothing to me. But ultimately, if you guys, by any chance, any of these clues convincingly help you understand exactly where you are handed into, definitely let me know in the comments below if you have any kind of guessing of who any of these people are by and large. Let me know in the comments below how you feel about this season so far. Maybe you're just like, yeah, I'm not liking this season, or I think this is the best season ever. By and large, you can just kind of let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, I'm going to get out of here. Hopefully, to do other reviews or other gameplays, any ways of doing any number of things. So I'm going to hit the bricks, get out of here. Thank you for otherwise watching any number of these reviews or any number of anything that I have done at this point. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, Rory.